It was a clear, sunny morning, and the flight was about to take off from a bustling airport, heading to a popular vacation destination. The passengers were mostly excited, chatting with one another, and looking forward to their trips. Among them were two very different women, unknowingly set on a path that would make their journey far from ordinary. In first class, Karen sat in her seat, her face already showing signs of discomfort. A middle-aged woman, dressed in expensive clothes, she had always thought of herself as someone deserving of luxury and attention. First class was where she felt she truly belonged, and it was clear she took pride in this status. But as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she noticed something that made her uneasy. Across from her, a black woman sat confidently in her first-class seat. She was in her late 20s, with a calm, serene expression that suggested she was comfortable and happy to be traveling. Her outfit was simple but elegant, and she had a peaceful demeanor, making it clear she was just another passenger who had paid for her ticket and was ready to enjoy the flight. But Karen couldn't help herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just that the black woman was sitting across from her. It was the fact that Karen felt she didn't belong in a space like this. First class was supposed to be reserved for people like her, people who had earned their place with money, status, and privilege. And this woman, in her mind, didn't fit that image. The flight attendants moved around the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, and Karen watched the black woman closely, wondering why she had the nerve to sit there. Her discomfort grew, and a sense of entitlement began to take over. She felt she had the right to make a complaint. After all, the plane was hers in her eyes, and everything should fit her idea of perfection. Without thinking, she leaned over and pressed the button to call the flight attendant. When the young attendant came over, Karen put on her most polite, yet cold, smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with a sense of superiority, "but I don't think this woman belongs in first class. I'm feeling uncomfortable." The attendant raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to make of the situation. She glanced at the black woman, who was reading a book, completely unaware of Karen's growing frustration. "I'm sorry, Mom," the flight attendant said softly, "but everyone in first class has a valid ticket." She tried to keep the situation calm, not wanting to escalate anything further. However, Karen's dissatisfaction only seemed to grow. The black woman noticed the shift in the atmosphere and raised her head from her book. She could sense the tension between her and Karen. Still, she remained composed. She didn't want to cause any trouble or draw attention to herself. It was just a flight. She had every right to be in that seat, just like anyone else. But as Karen's eyes stayed locked on her, she could feel the judgment, something she had encountered far too often in her life. However, she refused to let it affect her. She had earned her place here, just as much as anyone else. Meanwhile, Karen's irritation didn't fade. Instead, it was growing. She could hardly believe the audacity of this woman. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right, and her frustration was starting to build. It wasn't long before she decided that she needed to do something about it. After all, she was in first class, and she had the power to make things right, or so she thought. The black woman noticed Karen's sudden tension and could feel the eyes of other passengers now on her, but she simply sat back and tried to relax. She didn't know what Karen was thinking, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to give in to someone else's prejudice. She was not going to let someone else's insecurities affect her journey today. In this moment, neither woman knew that the story was only just beginning, and a confrontation was about to unfold that neither could have predicted. As the plane continued its journey into the sky, the tension between Karen and the black woman grew thicker. Karen's irritation wasn't something she could hide anymore. She crossed her arms tightly, glaring at the black woman across from her. Every few moments, Karen would glance at her, as if hoping to find something that would justify her feelings. But there was nothing. The woman was simply sitting there, reading her book, looking peaceful and calm. The more Karen watched, the more uncomfortable she became. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks to the first-class passengers. As they passed by, Karen tried once more to get their attention. She raised her hand, snapping her fingers slightly to make sure they noticed her. The flight attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, walked over to Karen's seat. She was about to ask if Karen needed anything when Karen spoke up immediately. "I'm sorry, but I don't think it's right for someone like her to be in first class," Karen said, nodding toward the black woman. Her tone was not loud, but it carried a sense of authority, as though she was making a demand. "I feel very uncomfortable. Can you do something about it?" The flight attendant, a little taken aback by Karen's request, glanced at the black woman sitting across from her. The woman was still quietly reading her book, unaware of the growing tension. The attendant, who was used to handling all kinds of situations, tried to maintain a calm demeanor. She had worked in first class long enough to know that some passengers could be particularly difficult, but this was different. She wasn't sure how to respond to Karen's comment. "Ma'am, everyone in first class has a valid ticket, and they have every right to be here," the attendant said, trying to keep the situation as neutral as possible. She didn't want to get into an argument, but she needed to stand her ground. Karen's expression tightened. "I understand that," she said, her voice becoming more insistent. "But I don't think she belongs here. I don't feel safe with her so close to me." The flight attendant could feel the weight of Karen's words, but she also noticed something in her tone. It wasn't just about the seat. It was something more. Something deeper, a subtle hint of prejudice that Karen might not even have been fully aware of herself. The attendant hesitated for a moment before responding. "I assure you, ma'am, she is not a threat. She's just here like everyone else, and we treat all passengers equally." It was clear that the attendant was trying her best to de-escalate the situation without drawing more attention to the issue. But Karen was relentless. She wasn't backing down. "I don't care what you say," she replied, her voice growing more firm. "I want her moved. I'm not comfortable." The black woman, now aware that something was happening, put her book down and looked up. She could feel the weight of Karen's words, the coldness in her gaze. Still, she remained calm. She refused to let herself get caught up in someone else's discomfort. She had every right to sit in that seat, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel less than. But she could feel the growing pressure, the stares of the passengers who were starting to notice the situation unfolding. Despite everything, she stayed composed. She didn't react with anger, nor did she let the situation unsettle her. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, and she had learned over the years to simply rise above it. It wasn't about her. It was about Karen's own issues. But Karen was not ready to let it go, and she continued to press the flight attendants, making her feelings known over and over. As the minutes passed, the situation was becoming unbearable for the flight crew. They had a choice: to let the tension continue to build or to address it more seriously. The flight attendants exchanged glances, knowing that this wasn't a small matter anymore. They would have to figure out a way to make this situation end before it escalated any further. As the flight continued, the tension in first class was palpable. Karen's frustration was growing, and her discomfort was clear to everyone around her. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, tapping her foot impatiently as she waited for the flight attendants to take action. Her eyes never left the black woman sitting across from her, who remained calm and composed, still reading her book as though nothing was amiss. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She was convinced that something had to be done. She wasn't going to let this woman ruin her flight. As soon as the flight attendant passed by again, Karen waved her down, her tone now more forceful. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm and insistent. "I told you I'm not comfortable. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like everything is fine. You need to move her out of first class. Now." The flight attendant stopped, her expression carefully neutral. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. Karen's demands were becoming unreasonable, and the flight attendant could see that the black woman had done nothing wrong. She was just sitting quietly, minding her own business. The flight attendant had already tried to defuse the situation, but it was clear that Karen wasn't going to let it go so easily. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, keeping her voice steady, "I've already explained that everyone here has a valid ticket for first class. There is no reason to move anyone." She paused for a moment, trying to keep the situation calm. "Please understand, it's not possible to change the seating arrangements based on personal preferences." But Karen was relentless. She didn't seem to care that the attendant was just doing her job. "I don't care about your rules," she snapped. "I'm telling you, I'm uncomfortable. You have to do something about this." She looked at the other passengers, as if expecting someone to agree with her, but most of them were looking away, trying to avoid getting involved. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. The black woman, sensing the growing tension, decided it was time to speak. She closed her book and sat up straighter, her calm demeanor still intact despite the situation. "Excuse me," she said, turning toward Karen. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm just trying to enjoy my flight. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of firmness in it, making it clear that she wasn't going to let Karen's attitude affect her. Karen stared at her for a moment, clearly not expecting this response. Her jaw tightened, and she opened her mouth to retort, but the flight attendant quickly stepped in. "Ma'am, there's no reason to escalate this further," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "We will be landing soon, and there's no need for this behavior. I ask that you both remain calm." But Karen was beyond reasoning now. She huffed and sat back in her seat, but her eyes never left the black woman, still burning with judgment and frustration. The atmosphere in the cabin was heavy, and it felt as though every passenger could sense the tension growing. Some looked around nervously, unsure of how this would end. The black woman, though, remained unfazed. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew that there was no point in letting someone else's prejudice spoil her experience. She took a deep breath and looked out the window, choosing to focus on the journey ahead. She refused to let Karen's behavior ruin her mood. But Karen wasn't ready to let it go. As the plane soared higher into the sky, she made a decision. She wasn't going to back down this time. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She wasn't going to let the flight attendants control the situation any longer. With a quick glance toward the black woman, she began dialing. It was clear that she had decided to take matters into her own hands. She was going to call the police. Karen's fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she dialed the number for the police. She was determined now, convinced that her complaint was justified, even if no one else seemed to agree. She pressed the phone to her ear, waiting for the ring, her face set in a stern expression. She was no longer willing to sit quietly and let the situation unfold. She felt her power in the action of calling the authorities. The black woman across from her, still calm and composed, had no idea what was coming. But Karen didn't care. In her mind, she was in the right. As the phone rang, Karen's gaze remained fixed on the black woman. She couldn't understand why the woman hadn't reacted, why she wasn't being more apologetic or submissive. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she was in control of the situation, that the authorities would arrive soon, and everything would be set right. Finally, the phone clicked, and a voice on the other end of the line answered. 911. What's your emergency? Yes, Karen said quickly, her voice cold and sharp. I'm on a flight, and there's a woman in first class who's making me feel unsafe. She's not supposed to be here, and I'm being harassed by her. I need you to send the police to the airport to meet the plane when we land. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but professional. Ma'am, we can't send police unless there's a real emergency. Can you tell me what's happening? What kind of threat are you experiencing? Karen's frustration mounted as she tried to explain. She's disturbing the peace, and I just don't feel safe with her sitting so close to me. I don't think she belongs here. I want the authorities to remove her when we land. The dispatcher listened for a moment before responding, trying to get to the heart of the issue. I understand you're upset, But unless there's an immediate threat to safety, we can't just send officers to the plane. We suggest you talk to the flight attendants and let them handle the situation. They're trained to manage things like this." Karen's grip on the phone tightened. "No, I need the police. She's not following the rules. I'm not going to sit here and feel uncomfortable while she's in first class. I want her removed." The dispatcher remained calm, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but we're not sending the police unless there's an actual reason to do so. You need to speak to the airline staff. If they need assistance, we'll be happy to help." Karen's face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, hanging up the phone abruptly. She turned to the flight attendant, who had been watching the exchange with concern. "I've called the police. I want something done about this." The flight attendant tried to remain composed. "Ma'am, the police won't be involved unless there's a real emergency. I assure you, we're doing everything we can to keep the flight comfortable for everyone. But we cannot take action without proper cause." Karen was seething now. She looked back at the black woman, who was still sitting quietly, her book in her lap, as she gazed out the window. There was something about the woman's calmness that seemed to infuriate Karen even more. How could she remain so composed when Karen was so clearly upset? The flight attendant, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, turned to the other flight attendants for support. They exchanged worried glances, not sure how far Karen would go with her demands. But they knew they needed to handle it carefully. They couldn't let the flight descend into chaos, and they couldn't allow one passenger to hold the entire cabin hostage with her unreasonable request. As Karen's frustration grew, the black woman, still quiet and calm, looked over at the flight attendants. She knew something was wrong, and she had a feeling that this wasn't just about her being in first class. She was starting to realize that Karen's anger wasn't about her at all. It was about something much deeper, something Karen hadn't said out loud, but was clear in the way she carried herself. The black woman took a deep breath, deciding to speak up once more. She wasn't going to sit back and let someone else dictate her experience. "I don't know what's going on here," she said softly but firmly, "but I'm just here to have a peaceful flight. I have a right to sit in this seat, just like anyone else." Karen glared at her, but for the first time, the black woman saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The atmosphere in first class had become thick with tension, and it was clear that things were about to take an unexpected turn. The plane began its descent, and the passengers could feel the gentle pull as the aircraft made its way toward the airport. The air in the cabin was heavy with tension. Karen sat in her seat, her arms crossed tightly, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She was still furious, her anger simmering just below the surface. Her eyes never left the black woman sitting across from her, who, despite everything, remained calm and composed. She had been nothing but polite and respectful, but Karen couldn't let it go. She felt like she had been wronged, and in her mind, someone needed to pay for it. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for landing, but they couldn't help but notice the growing tension between Karen and the other woman. They exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to resolve the situation. It was clear that Karen was not going to let things go quietly, and the last thing they wanted was for the situation to escalate further. As the plane touched down on the runway, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a soft thud, Karen could feel a sense of vindication. She knew the police would be waiting at the airport, ready to deal with the situation. She felt certain that the black woman would be escorted off the plane in handcuffs, her presence in first class somehow seen as an offense. For a moment, Karen allowed herself to imagine the moment the authorities arrived and took charge. She imagined the black woman being dragged off the plane, her wrongdoings exposed. But as the plane taxied toward the gate, the mood in first class shifted. Some passengers seemed to hold their breath. Others stole glances at the two women, unsure of what was going to happen next. The black woman, still sitting in her seat, glanced out the window. She had no idea what Karen had done, but she had a sinking feeling that the situation was about to come to a head. Karen's phone buzzed in her hand as she checked for any updates, but there was no word from the authorities. She didn't care. She was confident the police would be there waiting for her when the plane landed. She had made the call, and in her mind, that meant she had done what needed to be done. As the plane slowed to a stop, the flight attendants began their final preparations for deplaning. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing the arrival at the gate and urging passengers to remain seated until the aircraft had fully come to a stop. Karen couldn't wait to stand, to make her way off the plane, and to see the outcome of her actions. But just as she was preparing to grab her things and stand up, she heard a faint but unmistakable sound from the front of the plane. It was the sound of footsteps, the soft shuffle of shoes on the carpet. Karen's heart skipped a beat as she watched two police officers appear at the front of the cabin, their uniforms sharp and their faces unreadable. They were moving swiftly, their eyes scanning the cabin for anyone who might be causing trouble. Karen's breath quickened. She looked at the flight attendants, who were now exchanging glances, clearly trying to gauge what would happen next. The police officers walked down the aisle, pausing for a moment in front of the black woman's seat. Karen couldn't believe her eyes. She thought for sure they were there to deal with her complaint, to remove the black woman from the plane. But instead, the officers seemed to be focusing on something entirely different. The officers turned to Karen, and for the first time, Karen felt a surge of panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone calm but firm, "we've been informed about your call. We need to ask you a few questions." Karen's heart raced as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't how she had imagined it at all. She thought the black woman would be the one to face the consequences of this situation, but now the focus was on her. The black woman remained seated, her eyes steadied as she watched the officers approach. She had a feeling she knew what was about to unfold, but she still couldn't believe what was happening. The officer continued, "We've reviewed the situation, and we believe your complaint was based on a misunderstanding. The flight crew has informed us that there was no disturbance or threat from anyone in the cabin." Karen's face turned red, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the officer raised a hand to stop her. "We also have a record of your call to the police, and based on our investigation, it appears that your claim was not legitimate. You are being detained for making a false report." Karen's eyes widened in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What?" she stammered. "No, this is wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer interrupted her. "Ma'am, please come with us. You will need to speak to someone at the airport." The airport was a whirlwind of activity as passengers began to disembark, but the tension that had built up on the plane lingered in the air. The black woman, still processing what had just happened, stepped off the aircraft with a calm demeanor. She walked through the gate with a quiet confidence, her steps steady. Despite the chaos that had just unfolded behind her, she didn't let it rattle her. She could hear snippets of conversations around her as she moved toward the baggage claim area. People were talking about what they had witnessed, sharing shocked expressions, and whispering to each other. Most of them had seen Karen being escorted by the police, but the black woman couldn't bring herself to feel satisfaction over the situation. She hadn't wanted it to escalate in the first place, and though she had stood her ground, part of her wished the entire ordeal hadn't happened. Her thoughts were interrupted as she heard a voice calling her name. She turned to see one of the flight attendants from the plane walking toward her. The young woman's face was a mix of relief and concern. She gave a small wave and smiled. "I just wanted to check on you," the attendant said, her voice warm. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I wish we could have done more to stop it earlier." The black woman smiled back, nodding to show she appreciated the concern. "It's all right. I'm just glad it's over. Thank you for trying to keep things calm." The flight attendant looked over her shoulder, almost nervously, as if unsure whether to say something more. "You handled everything so well. It was honestly impressive. I've seen passengers get upset over much less, but you didn't let it bother you." The black woman gave a small chuckle. I've had to deal with my fair share of things like this. It's just part of the journey sometimes. But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? The flight attendant nodded in agreement, her expression thoughtful. It's a sad truth. People get so caught up in their own world, and sometimes they forget that everyone else has just as much right to be there. You did the right thing by staying calm. The black woman appreciated the kind words but didn't want to dwell on it for too long. I hope the rest of the flight was smooth, she said, trying to shift the topic. The attendant smiled. It was. Much quieter without the tension. I think we're all ready to forget about the drama that unfolded. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around before speaking again. The police told us that they were going to have a word with Karen when she was escorted out, and she might face charges for filing a false report. I just wanted you to know that. The black woman sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. It was one of frustration. I didn't want any of this to happen. I never called the police. I wasn't causing any problems. I was just trying to get to my destination like everyone else. I know, the attendant said gently, but you shouldn't have been made to feel like that either. No one deserves that kind of treatment, especially over something so trivial. The black woman nodded, her gaze drifting toward the baggage claim area where her luggage was being unloaded. I appreciate it. I'm just glad I didn't lose my composure. The flight attendant smiled again, her face full of admiration. You were amazing. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. I will, the black woman replied with a small grin. But I think I'm all right. Just need to put this behind me. As the two women parted ways, the black woman felt a slight weight lifted off her shoulders. She had handled the situation with grace and dignity, and despite everything, she wasn't going to let it define her. She could see the airport terminal buzzing with activity, the usual flow of travelers eager to continue their journeys. For a moment, she let herself just breathe. The incident was over, and now she could move on. Walking toward the exit, she couldn't help but think about how often people like Karen made judgments without understanding the full picture. People who felt they had the right to dictate others' lives based on appearances or preconceived notions. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. It wasn't the first time she had faced unfair treatment, and it wouldn't be the last. But it didn't have to define her. She could hear a conversation taking place nearby. Two women talking about the events that had just transpired. They were shaking their heads in disbelief, commenting on how Karen's actions were completely uncalled for. For a moment, the black woman considered joining the conversation, but she decided against it. There was no need to explain herself to anyone. She had already spoken up when it mattered most, and that was enough. As she exited the airport, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the city. It was a new chapter in her journey, one she was ready to embrace. The world might sometimes be unfair, but she wasn't going to let that stop her from reaching her goals. With a steady heart, she stepped into the crowd, leaving behind the events of the flight as she moved forward, ready for whatever came next. The black woman walked through the airport, her mind still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded on the plane. She could feel the weight of the situation, but there was a sense of relief in knowing it was behind her. She had never imagined that something so simple, just taking a flight, could become such a dramatic, unexpected ordeal. But now that it was over, she was ready to move on. Her luggage had arrived, and she grabbed her suitcase from the baggage claim carousel. The terminal was busy, with people hurrying to their next destinations, catching flights, and reuniting with loved ones. It was a sea of strangers, but in that moment it felt like the black woman was in her own little world. Despite the earlier tension, she was determined not to let it affect her further. As she made her way toward the exit, a soft voice called out to her. She turned and saw a woman waving at her, a familiar face. It was the flight attendant who had spoken to her earlier. The woman's expression was kind, and she seemed genuinely concerned. "I just wanted to check on you one more time," the flight attendant said, walking over to her. "I saw that you handled everything with such calm and grace. I wanted to make sure you were okay." The black woman smiled warmly, grateful for the support. "Thank you. It's been a strange day, but I'm fine now." The flight attendant nodded. "I can't believe how that woman acted. It was honestly so unnecessary. I've never seen someone create so much drama over something so small. You were right to stay calm, though. That's not easy." The black woman chuckled lightly. "I've had to deal with situations like that before. Sometimes it's better to stay quiet and let people show themselves for who they really are." The flight attendant's eyes softened. "I know it's not always easy to let things slide, but you did it with so much dignity. I really admire that." "Well, thank you for saying that," the black woman replied, her voice sincere. "I just try not to let people like her get to me. There's always someone like that who thinks they can push others around, but it's not worth the energy." The flight attendant smiled, a little sad but also impressed. "I know, you handled it way better than I could have. But I have to admit, it was so surprising to see how things turned out. I never imagined that Karen would be the one escorted off the plane. It really caught me off guard." The black woman nodded, a sigh escaping her lips. "I wasn't expecting that either. But I guess sometimes people reveal themselves in ways that you can't predict. She really thought she was in the right, and I was the one who was going to be in trouble. I never wanted to make a big scene. But I also wasn't going to let her make me feel less than." "I'm glad you didn't," the flight attendant said firmly. "And just so you know, we've all been talking. Some passengers even said something to the crew after everything. They were appalled by her actions. She was completely out of line." The black woman smiled, appreciating the support from the crew and passengers. It was a small comfort, but it made her feel like she wasn't alone in what had happened. "It's good to hear that. Sometimes it feels like you're the only one who sees things for what they really are." "I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been for you," the attendant said softly. "I'm just so glad it's over now." "Me too," the black woman agreed. "I'm ready to move on from it and enjoy my trip. I don't want anything to hold me back." "Absolutely. You deserve to have a smooth rest of the journey," the flight attendant said with a bright smile. "And just know that you handled everything with such strength. It wasn't easy, but you did it." With a final nod and a warm exchange of good wishes, the two women parted ways. The black woman walked out of the terminal, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The ordeal had been intense, but she had made it through, and now it was time to put it all behind her. The city was bustling with life, and the possibilities ahead of her felt endless. As she stepped into a taxi and gave the driver her destination, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The day had been long, but she felt stronger for having gone through it. She had stood her ground, stayed composed, and in the end, she had emerged unscathed. In that moment, she realized that the world might sometimes be unpredictable, but she had the power to navigate it with grace. The taxi sped through the streets, and as the black woman looked out at the city skyline, she smiled. She was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that no one could take away her sense of self. Life had its challenges, but she was more than capable of facing them. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. She had survived, and she had thrived. The black woman arrived at her hotel after a short but peaceful ride from the airport. The day had been a whirlwind, full of unexpected challenges and moments of discomfort. But now, as she stood in the lobby of the hotel, the buzz of the city just outside, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had made it through an uncomfortable situation with grace and dignity, and now it was time to focus on what lay ahead. She checked in at the front desk, smiling at the receptionist who greeted her warmly. The room was ready, and the staff was eager to help with her bags. As she made her way to the elevator, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It was finally over. She had stood her ground when it mattered, and now she was ready to put the events of the day behind her. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and she stepped into the quiet space, the soft hum of the machinery a welcome sound after the noise of the airport. As the elevator ascended, she reflected on the earlier events. She had faced an unfounded accusation and had to endure the discomfort of being judged without cause. But in the end, things had worked out. She felt proud of how she had handled everything, remaining calm and composed throughout the entire ordeal. When the elevator reached her floor, she stepped out into the hallway and walked to her room. The door clicked open, and she found herself in a simple, cozy space, just what she needed to unwind. She set her suitcase down by the bed and let out a long breath, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. The room was a small sanctuary, a quiet place to retreat after the chaos she had endured. She took a moment to unpack, putting her clothes in the drawers and organizing her things. As she moved around the room, her mind wandered back to the flight. The entire experience had been strange and unsettling, but in the end, she was able to maintain control. She hadn't allowed someone else's judgment to dictate how she felt, and that was something she could be proud of. The rest of the evening passed quietly. She ordered some dinner from room service and ate it slowly while watching the city lights twinkle outside her window. The food wasn't spectacular, but it was comforting. There was something soothing about the simplicity of it all. The meal, the view, the quiet space. For the first time all day, she felt like she could relax. As the evening wore on, she sat by the window, sipping her drink and watching the world outside. It felt good to be alone with her thoughts, to reflect on everything that had happened and how she had come out stronger. The city was still bustling below, but up here, in her hotel room, everything felt calm and distant. She didn't need to worry about anything anymore. Before long, she decided it was time to get some rest. She had a busy day ahead of her, and the past few hours had been exhausting. She crawled into bed, pulled the covers around her, and closed her eyes. The soft hum of the city outside faded into the background as she drifted off to sleep, the events of the day slowly melting away. As she lay there in the dark, she couldn't help but smile to herself. The day had been filled with challenges, but it had also been a reminder of her strength and resilience. She had faced a difficult situation and had come out the other side with her dignity intact. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready for it. The world might throw obstacles in her path, but she was more than capable of overcoming them. The night passed peacefully, and when the morning sun peeked through the curtains, she woke up feeling refreshed and ready for whatever the day had in store. The journey was far from over, but the black woman was determined to make the most of it. She had faced one challenge and come through it stronger, and that was all the motivation she needed to keep moving forward. The future was hers to shape, and she was ready to embrace it.